Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Yesterday we got our first look at the 2920X and then the 2970WX processors. And for that initial review, the focus really was on productivity performance. But I did promise that soon after we would dive a bit deeper into the gaming performance. So that's what we'll be doing today. Unfortunately though, I still haven't had time to update the Skylake X CPUs with many of the newly released titles that we will be looking at in this video. But there have been plenty of comparisons in the past on the channel comparing the 1920X, the 1950X, and even the 2950X with a whole heap of Skylake X CPUs. So it's not like we haven't seen that data before, but I admit it would have been nice if I had have had time to update, but just adding one CPU to the list is a day or so's worth of testing. So forgive me, but I think what we have is still very useful. Anyway, the focus here is to see how well the 24-core and 32-core models work with the new dynamic local mode, and I should note that all the testing has been conducted with this new mode enabled. Since it doesn't require a restart, I'm happy to test and even recommend this mode, whereas I wasn't really a fan of the game mode, as it requires a reset and basically nerfs the processor's productivity performance. So, if you primarily require a workstation computer, but wouldn't mind also using it to blow off some steam by playing a few games every now and then, how well does that actually work? And assuming you're not a high refresh rate gamer looking to play something like CSGO competitively on your workstation PC, does gaming on a Threadripper rig even matter? In order to find that out, I'll be testing at 1440p and 4K with an RTX 2080 Ti, in addition to the CPU limited 1080p testing. Please note all systems were configured with DDR4 3200CL14 memory, and the quad channel platforms receive 32GB while the dual channel systems use 16GB. Okay, let's get in the results. First up we have Forza Horizon 4, which isn't a CPU intensive title, but we deliberately test with it to show how these CPUs compare in a typical game, as most gamers aren't heavily CPU bound using high-end modern processors. As you can see at 1080p, the Threadripper CPUs all deliver comparable frame time and average frame rate performance, which is interesting as the Ryzen 7 2700X is around 7% faster, matching the performance of the Intel CPUs. That said, at 1440p, the 2700X is no longer able to keep pace with the Intel CPUs, not something you'd expect to see given the results at 1080p. The Intel CPUs are up to 6% faster, but with all the processors enabling over 100 FPS at all times with an RTX 2080 Ti, the performance margin is almost meaningless. Then at 4K, we find the playing field is pretty well neutralized as all 8 processors allowed the RTX 2080 Ti to achieve maximum performance at this extreme resolution. Next up we have Star Wars Battlefront 2, which is a CPU intensive title, and here the Threadripper 2970WX is able to keep pace with the 2920X and 2950X, while the 2920WX still trips up Windows 10 with its many threads. For all other Threadripper CPUs, frame time performance is on par or slightly better than that of the 2700X. That said, at 1080p, the 2920X and 2970X are around 17% slower than the 9900K. Moving up to 1440p, and already we see that 17% margin come down to just 5%, and now the Threadripper CPUs are all able to match the 2700X. Basically, using these quality settings with an RTX 2080 Ti, it's near impossible to differentiate between the 9900K and, say, the 2920X, even with a live FPS counter. Then at 4K, as you might expect, there really is no difference between these CPUs. They basically all deliver the same frame time and average frame rate performance. So while Battlefront 2 is a CPU demanding title, by the time you reach the 4K resolution, it becomes significantly more GPU bound, even with the latest and greatest GPU. Next up we have Battlefield 1, and this title has been causing some grief with the GeForce RTX 2080 Ti. I've noticed that the last few drivers have been causing some odd performance behavior in this title. Not quite sure what's going on, but it will require some further investigation. Previously with the GTX 1080 Ti, the stock Core i7-8700K allowed for a 1% low result of around 135 FPS. But now with the RTX 2080 Ti, we've dropped down to 118 FPS. Then we also have some really odd results with the new 8-core 9th gen processors. We're moving to 1440p, and I'll touch on that in a moment. Anyway, here at 1080p, we see that the Threadripper CPUs aren't that well utilized, and even the 2950X came in well behind the 2700X. Meanwhile, the Intel CPUs are noticeably faster, and please note the 200 FPS frame cap has actually been removed. It just so happens that the 9900K and 9700K averaged 200 FPS. Now, at 1440p, all CPUs see a huge decrease in frame time performance, with the exception of the 9900K and 9700K, which see a performance increase. This makes absolutely no sense, and for now I suspect this is a bug with the NVIDIA display driver. Anyway, the 2700X remains just ahead of the Threadripper CPUs, which means AMD's trailing Intel by a reasonable margin in this title. That said, at 4K, we do see once again a coming together of the results, and now the Threadripper CPUs are basically able to match the performance of the 9900K, at least when looking at the average frame rate. Moving on, we have Project Cars 2, and here we find very competitive performance between the 8700K and 2700X. The new 9900K and 9700K enable breathtaking performance with the RTX 2080 Ti at 1080p, pushing up over 150 FPS, making them around 35% faster than the 2700X. The Threadripper CPUs do enable highly playable performance, but compared to the mainstream Intel alternatives, you can see why we stress that these aren't gaming CPUs. Still, for casual gaming, they are more than capable, and we see that both the 2920X and 2970WX are still able to match the 2950X. Moving to 1440p, and here we see that the Ryzen 7 2700X is able to hang with the GPU-limited Intel competition, but we do see some drop-off for the average frame rate with the Threadripper models. Still, the frame time performance is impressive. Now, at 4K, we find pretty similar performance across the board. Frame time performance is still a little down on the Threadripper parts, but we're only talking a few frames here. Overall, the experience will be very much the same, so Project Cars 2 is certainly a pass for the Threadripper CPUs. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege is mostly GPU bound, even with an RTX 2080 Ti. That said, you'll still want a decent CPU to play this title. At 1080p, the Threadripper CPUs do surprisingly well and basically match the 2700X, which means they're just 17% slower than the Intel CPUs for the average frame rate. Given that we are seeing well over 170 FPS at all times, you have to wonder how much these margins even matter. We do see a bit of a performance drop-off in frame time performance for the 24-core and 32-core parts at 1440p. That said, both still did allow for over 100 FPS at all times. The 2920X matched the 2700X, while the 2950X was a whisker faster, basically matching the Intel CPUs. Then, as you'd expect, once again we do see a coming together at 4K. That said, the 24-core and 32-core parts still really struggle with frame time performance. The results aren't bad, but there is a noticeable drop-off when compared to the rest of the CPUs tested. Next up, we have Hitman, and here we have another title that doesn't play particularly well on the 2970WX and 2990WX, even with the dynamic local mode enabled. The game was playable, but you're looking at a much more enjoyable experience with the 2920X and 2950X, both of which were able to match the 2700X. That said, the Intel CPUs still offer vastly superior performance in this title at 1080p. At 1440p, the Intel CPUs still remained well ahead, especially when looking at the average frame rate performance. Still, the 2920X, 2950X, and 2700X were all acceptable. It was only the WX series that dipped into trouble. Even at 4K, we see Intel still enjoys a performance advantage. A small one, but still, there is a slight performance advantage there, and that isn't something we'd expect to see in what should be an extremely GPU-bound scenario. I do suspect that this is an NVIDIA display driver issue using the DirectX 12 API, but again, I haven't confirmed that. Some more testing will need to be done. Testing with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we see that the 2920X and 2950X match the frame time performance of the 2700X, while beating it by a reasonable margin for the average frame rate. So it's interesting to see the 12 and 16 core Threadripper CPUs offering a performance increase here over the 2700X, which I have to say was most unexpected. However, once we move to 1440p, the 2700X is now able to roughly match the average frame rate of the Threadripper CPUs while offering slightly better frame time performance, though overall the performance was very much the same between the 2920X, 2950X, and 2700X. They were certainly all comparable with the 9900K, as we are mostly GPU bound here. Again, even with the dynamic local mode enabled, we are seeing some serious frame time issues with the 2970WX and 2990WX processors. Then, as expected, at the 4K resolution, we are very much GPU bound, and with the exception of the 24-core and 32-core models, all CPUs enabled the same level of performance. Wrapping up the gaming benchmarks, we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and here we have some very interesting results. The previous Assassin's Creed Origins are very much liked a lot of cores, and Odyssey appears to be no different. Here we see at 1080p that the 2950X and 2920X are both quite a bit faster than the Ryzen 7 2700X. Not only that, but they offer slightly better frame time performance than the Intel CPUs despite a slightly lower average frame rate. Unfortunately, the 2970WX and 2990WX do suffer quite a lot when it comes to the frame time performance despite offering very respectable average frame rates. At 1440p we are almost entirely GPU bound, and here there's very little separating the 2950X, 2920X and 2700X, as well as the Intel CPUs. Frame time performance for the 24 core and 32 core models is still down a little bit, but given how GPU bound we are, the impact wasn't huge. Then at 4K, we're 100% GPU bound, and there's really no margins worth talking about here. So if you're gaming at 4K with what is currently the world's fastest gaming GPU, your choice of a modern high-end CPU really doesn't matter too much. Shocking conclusion time, guys. The 8700K, 9700K, and 9900K are the best gaming CPUs. Certainly better than the super core heavy workstation CPUs from AMD. Now that you've picked your jaw up off the floor from that completely unbelievable conclusion, obviously the point of this video wasn't to work out what the best gaming CPU is or if the Threadripper CPUs can take it to the 9900K in games, because you probably already know the answer to those questions. What I wanted to know is how well the 2920X and 2950X stack up against the more mainstream processors in modern titles, and not just at low CPU limited resolutions, but also at resolutions you're likely going to game at with high-end hardware. I also wanted to see how well the 2970WX and 2990WX work with dynamic local mode enabled. I guess the main reason to investigate gaming performance is to just see how viable it is. After all, if you want a dedicated high refresh rate gaming system, then my primary recommendation is the Core i7 8700K, and I guess now, if you have money to burn, and potentially you're dwelling, then check out the 9900K. However, if you're building a workstation to work on, but you'd also like to unwind and play a few games at night, how viable is gaming on a Threadripper system? Well, as it turns out, the 2920X and 2950X are extremely viable, and this has certainly been my experience over the past year or so with the 1950X. The 2970WX and 2990WX were for the most part okay, but overall performance is still a bit mixed, and the frame time performance is, well, that certainly appears to be a big issue in some of the titles that we tested. However, if you're spending at least, well, $1,300 US or up to $1,800 US on just the CPU, I have to imagine that building a dedicated, say, Core i7 8700K gaming rig, like what I've actually done, probably isn't out of the question. In fact, that's exactly what I've done with the set piece, but if I was to build my own dream sort of PC, it would be very much like Coffee Ripper. This has a 2950X in it with an 8700K. So perfect. And then a couple of graphics cards, some memory, and you're good to go. And then about $3,000 worth of liquid cooling. Alternatively, you could build a Ryzen 5 1600 system with a GTX 1070 Ti. That'll certainly get the job done very nicely. And, well, if you're spending $1,800 US on a CPU, like I said, that kind of setup probably would just be pocket change. And Tim actually built a system very similar to that on the channel. In fact, it did have a 1600 and a GTX 1070 Ti. And he claimed that that was the ultimate bang for your buck 1440p gaming rig. So if Tim said it, it must be true. And on a final note, results like what we saw in Assassin's Creed Odyssey are very interesting to me, and I wonder just how long it's going to be before we start seeing quite a few more titles that run better on the 2920X and 2950X when compared to the more mainstream 2700X, and I suppose even some of the 6 and 8 core Intel CPUs. Anyway, I'll leave you with that interesting thought. If you liked the video, well, you know what to do. At least I hope you know what to do. Subscribe for more content just like this. And if you appreciate the work we do at Unboxed, then consider supporting us on Patreon. You gain access to our private Discord chat where you can ask us whatever you want to ask us, suggest video ideas, anything at all. And we also do a monthly live stream, or a couple of monthly live streams, and they're also fun. You can get in the live chat and interact with us there. So anyway, thank you for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I will see you again next time. Probably. Please come back.